Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is April 3rd, 2017, and today we are a little bit more sober. I'm not going to say we're excited to talk about this topic because that would be inappropriate. Today, we have a very sober and important topic that we're going to be discussing. The title of today's presentation is or panel discussion is Utah's Escalating Suicide Crisis and LDS LGBTQ Despair. We're going to be talking about how the suicide rates in Utah, especially among youth, but also among adults, has been dramatically increasing over the past eight years or so. And I'm really grateful for the panelists that are willing to discuss this. So without any further ado, what I'm going to do is introduce two of our panelists, and a third will hopefully be joining us soon. But to begin with, I'm going to be introducing my cousin, Daniel Parkinson. Daniel is the author of the article that was released on rationalface.com. And in reality, they've done a series of blog posts on this topic. So Daniel, if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself a little bit, tell our audience about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Daniel Parkinson. I am a psychiatrist. I work in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I was raised in Utah, and I am gay and was raised LDS, and I've been involved somewhat in activism around the LGBT LDS issue for the past few years. And that's how I kind of got involved with this particular cause. And I've tried to use what little expertise I might have to promote a healthier situation especially for our LGBT youth in the Mormon sphere.
Beautiful. Well, cousin, it's great to have you. I should note that you were host of Gay Mormon Stories podcast for many, many episodes. And
Yep.
You've been on Mormon Stories before, at least as a part of a panel, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Well, welcome back. It's good to have you.
Thanks.
Our second panelist is Wendy Williams Montgomery. Wendy, why don't you unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for having me on. My name is Wendy Montgomery. My husband, Tom, hopefully is joining us a little bit later. A little bit about us. We've been married 22 years. We have 5 kids. We were raising our kids much like we were raised in very Orthodox conservative Mormon household. We moved from California to Arizona about 1.5 years ago. Our oldest son, who's now 18, came out to us as gay 5 years ago when he was 13. Turned our tidy little Mormon world upside down, changed our paradigm forever. But for the better, far, far, far for the better. He's such a blessing to us. And since then, we've just been quite outspoken and vocal on working to make the Mormon church and local communities more accepting and loving of LGBT people. We've been spokespeople and worked with the Family Acceptance Project. There's a documentary on our family called Families Are Forever. That kind of talks about the minefield of having a gay child in the Mormon church and how to navigate that. I'm on the board of Affirmation and Mama Dragons, one of the co-founders of Mama Dragons. We speak about this as often as we can just to increase awareness around the subject because we're losing too many.
All right. Well, Wendy, I'm glad to have you on Mormon Stories, and I'm sorry it's not about happier topics.
Yeah, me too.
And we'll introduce Tom as soon as he's able to join us. I want to thank our live listeners for tuning in. We actually already have 72 people tuned in live. A shout out to Danae, to David, who's joining us from the UK. Kevin Klusterman is joining us from Illinois. Randy,
Hey, Kevin.
Caleb. Lots of people joining us. So shout out to all our listeners. Just really quick to our live listeners. One of the main reasons we broadcast live is so that people can share with us comments and questions live. It's a little bit more participatory. So if anybody has stories or comments or questions or feedback, please post them to the live stream and we'll do our best to incorporate what we can into our discussion. So without any further ado, Daniel, I'm gonna come back to you. And one of the things I know for sure is that simply discussing suicidality at all, but particularly amongst LGBT populations and LGBT youth, is a very tricky matter. You know, there are concerns about suicide contagion. There are concerns about not wanting to make the problem worse. There's also concerns about weaponizing, you know, the tragic death of individuals for sort of social political purposes, and we don't want to do any of that. So Daniel, what I'd love to do is start with you talking about some guidelines for how to talk about this kind of stuff in the most constructive way. And then Wendy, I'm going to bring you on after Daniel to give your 2 cents. But Daniel, why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay, well, I'll just go down the do's and the don'ts that that are accepted. They just know that there's a huge difference in the rates of suicide contagion or copycat suicides based on how the issue is covered by the press. So we want to consider any public discussion about suicide or even Facebook posts to have a similar you know, implications, similar. We need to take responsibility for how we discuss it. First of all, we do have to discuss it. There's no question that we need to discuss it, but here's the 12 main points. It says, do emphasize individual and collective responsibility for supporting the well-being of LGBT people. Do encourage help seeking by LGBT people who may be contemplating suicide and emphasize the availability of resources. 3, do emphasize the vital importance of family support and acceptance, not just for suicide, but for many things. Do not include details of a suicide death in titles or headlines, and don't describe the method used in a suicide death. Don't attribute a suicide death to experiences known or believed to have occurred shortly before the person died. That's really important because that means we have to be careful about guessing why they committed suicide, right? Don't normalize suicide by presenting it as the logical consequence of the kinds of bullying, rejection, and discrimination and exclusion that LGBT often experience. So that's, once again, is tricky because we know that all those things do contribute to suicide, but it doesn't, we need to emphasize that suicide not an inevitable outcome. And that's important so that the people who are contemplating suicide will be able to see other ideas of how to escape from their despair. Number 8 is don't idolize suicide victims or create an aura of celebrity around them. Once again, that can be hard to do when we're trying to really, you know, mourn and remember a person. Don't use terms like bullycide, which is sort of the same idea. It suggests that suicide is a natural response to bullying. Don't talk about suicide epidemics. Once again, tricky here because we are talking about a phenomenon of elevated suicide rates. But we have to realize, and in this context, it's certainly an ongoing thing. It's not like an epidemic in the sense that it's just this year. We would have trouble calling an epidemic something that's been going on this long. Don't use the word successful or unsuccessful or failed when talking about suicide. So instead you should say died from suicide, a suicide death, an attempted suicide. And the most common word, committed suicide, it's nice if we can get away from saying committed suicide, but instead say died by suicide. And last of all, don't say that a specific policy or its absence will in and of itself prevent suicide. That's once again tricky because we have a lot of studies that show how policies impact suicide. But once again, we want to get away from they talk about how anti-LGBT laws or policies have shown to negatively impact the well-being of LGBT people. So those are the main things. It suggests also not using Twitter or Facebook to announce news of suicide deaths. Don't repost problematic mainstream media headlines on your Facebook. These are just things that all of us can do. And we shouldn't call it a suicide epidemic in the social media. And be careful how you phrase things, right? Unfortunately, we now have more options besides liking a post, so it's nicer to, use a different icon, right? Emoticon when we're responding to somebody else's post. So those are sort of the basics on what we are going to try to do, and we don't always succeed 100% because they're complicated issues, and we do have a mandate to bring awareness to this problem, because there are solutions, and if we don't bring awareness, the solutions aren't going to be responded to. And when you say we don't want to weaponize the suicide issue, we don't want to weaponize it, but we certainly want to learn from the suicides that have happened and use that to prevent future suicides. So if you're calling that weaponizing, that's not how I see it. But I wouldn't necessarily want to use that as my argument that, we should legalize gay marriage, except that once again, we do see an impact on the legalization of marriages and the suicide rate, as we'll see. So it's a tricky issue. It's tricky to call it weaponizing, and that is often how a community might see it when they're seeing the gay community as the adversary. Then they'll jump to the conclusion that the gay community is weaponizing. So, but anyway, I don't know if that kind of covers what we ought to as far as the basics about safely discussing suicide.
Yeah, I want to respond to that list. We're going to go ahead and post a link to that list in our blog post. Maybe I'll also post it to the comment section. But while I'm doing that, Wendy, what do you want to add to what Daniel said? And then I kind of want to give a reaction. But Wendy, let me give you a chance first.
Right. It's a really inclusive, good list. I love all the stuff on there. But I have to say, even if you are following every one of those things, you are still going to get significant pushback from people when you talk about this issue. Right after the policy, November 2015, the next few months, I received lots of messages from family members who had lost people to suicide recently. And when that story went public, even though I was following every one of those criteria, there was significant pushback about even talking about it. So I don't want that to scare people away from talking about it. Expect pushback, especially when suicide is really complicated. It's never just one issue where somebody decides that they are going to attempt suicide. It's multifaceted. But we also know that one of the major reasons people attempt suicide is rejection of some form. So whether they're feeling rejection from family, rejection from church, rejection from their community, there needs to be a little bit of culpability that we talk about that the church has in this. Not 100% at all, I'm not saying that, but it's there. And when we say things like it's the altitude, it's screen time, it's air quality, we're ignoring what's actually happening. So we should address that. It's, a little bit here, and what we can do as members of the church, whether active, inactive, in or out, to help these kids. Because I'm more worried about the children than I am about being politically correct or seen as saying things the right way, even within the list that Daniel mentioned. It's so important that we're reaching these kids. And right now, the ones that are the most at risk are sitting in our pews on Sunday. So those are the ones that we need to find a way to get to and let them know that they're loved and accepted and valued.
Beautiful. We're going to cover all that today. Austin writes what we're all trying to express. How do we create necessary alarm by avoiding all those things like calling it an epidemic? So Austin is reflecting the challenge of what we're trying to do. We're not trying to alarm. We're not trying to weaponize. We're not trying to spread. But I think, Daniel,
we
to your
do want
point,
to alarm.
to not talk about it is there's a form of being complicit just by not talking, right, Daniel?
Right.
There should be alarm. We need
Yeah.
alarm. Okay. We're not saying that, but we just want to discuss it responsibly. And that doesn't mean not discussing it, but that just means trying to take these guidelines that are there. And even if they do slow down the discussion a little bit, let's just follow them, because we don't want to hurt the people we're trying to help. But that nowhere does it say stop talking about the problem. Nowhere does it say don't be alarmed that there's a lot of youth suicides, or the youth suicides have tripled in 10 years. You know, those things should be alarming to everybody, but they shouldn't be painted as this is an inevitable outcome for all our LGBT youth. That's different. And
Jennifer is asking this question. Maybe you've already answered it, Daniel. She's saying, why not use the term epidemic? What's the downside of using that term? Daniel?
I didn't develop the guidelines, but I just want to, I think that when we talk about epidemics, it's big headline grabbing thing, and you become part of it. And I don't want suicidal people that are feeling suicidal to say, oh, there's this epidemic, and
and to get swept up
and
in
want
it.
to align with it, get swept up in it. I'm guessing and that's sort of the philosophy around the other guidelines, is that we want the actual suicidal person to not get too closely connected to how they might identify with the suicidal as an option for them. We're trying to get away from people thinking this is for me, this is the inevitable outcome. I'm a gay Mormon. I don't have other choices. There's this epidemic of gay Mormon suicides. I should, I don't see another choice. I'm going to be part of this epidemic. And
got it. Okay. So to not talk, got it. Talk about it with an intent to educate and inform, not to sort of incite, strong emotions that are sort of overwhelming to people, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we want the right emotions, I guess. We want people to be concerned, and we want people to be focused on the corrective measures, the solutions, and both in the lives of the individual and as a, epidemiological factor, as a state church-wide, we're focusing on what can improve things.
Got it. Yeah, Blair writes, the phraseology epidemic implies that the risk factors are out of people's control and makes it harder to change things. That's what Blair writes. That's a nice comment.
So
Wendy,
that's nice. Yeah.
Were you gonna add something, Amy? Or Wendy? I'm sorry, Wendy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, I agree with everything that Daniel's saying. Epidemic maybe is a strong word, but we need to be having strong conversations around this.
Yeah.
Too many, we're losing too many, and if we shy away from this conversation, that's helping no one.
Exactly. And I think, and Daniel, I think it's time to actually go and talk about the actual rates. And what I'm going to do for just a second is actually visually share the graph, because it's really telling in terms of the trend line. So I'm going to go ahead and show that for a minute, Daniel. Why don't you just start talking about the numbers and what the trend has been over the past 8 or 9 years, and we'll show the graphic for a minute as you start.
Should we bring Thomas in before we get going further?
Okay, Thomas has joined us. So good. Let me add Thomas really quick to the panel. Hopefully Thomas's microphone will just kind of work. I'll unmute it. Thomas, pull your screen down a little bit. Good. Thomas, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Introduce yourself really quick, if you don't mind.
I am Wendy's husband. That's the extent of my qualifications, I think.
And Jordan's father.
And Jordan's father, yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
Nothing. I think my contribution has just been with Wendy and with Daniel in that we've been pointing to these negative trends for a long time. It's not like this is the coming out of nowhere. We've been speaking on this for 3 or 4 years because it's been escalating for 8 or 9. So it's it's not something that's just jumped out of the woodwork.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Tom missed the introduction, but I'll just point out that Tom and Wendy have both been extremely active in the activist community and in different ways. Wendy's done more national media interviews, but Tom's done a lot more writing, and his pieces have reached a really big audience. And among a bunch of other things, but that's kind of how I've most worked with him. So.
Thomas, Daniel's better at introducing you than you are, apparently.
Yeah, I don't do it too often, so it probably is.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Okay, Daniel, I'm going to go ahead and switch the screen for a minute to the trend lines. And why don't you start talking about the numbers so that we can just educate the audience?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at that graph, it kind of speaks for itself. This is the rate of suicides in age 12 to 21. I grabbed that data from CDC. They actually give you a lot of flexibility in pulling out data, and you can choose any age range. They naturally group them a little bit differently, but I was interested in this group, the age 12 to 21. So this group also just has what you see is looks horrific, right? Just a rate that's just seems to be shooting for the moon here. And I think it's pretty notable that things were just hanging around 10 per 100,000 for a long time. They dropped down for unclear reasons in the, around 2006, but then kind of went back up to that baseline. But since then, in a few short years, it's just been going up, up, up. And that trend continued in 2015.
Can I interrupt for just a sec?
Please.
Yeah.
I'm looking at this graph, and I'm hoping that the people that are listening or watching are able to see this. Don't just see lines on a graph, that they recognize that these are people. These are 12 to 21. These are our children. Like, look at that and think of how many people that represents that are no longer with us. Like, humanize this a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. And what it doesn't show is absolute number of deaths sort of per year. This is.
Well, I could have put that too, but I wanted to compare it to the US rate. And as you see that line, the US rate is a lot lower than Utah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, once again, when we talk about exact numbers, we wonder if we're getting in that problem areas that we discussed and things to avoid. But we can see that the rate is unacceptably high. And
if you want to talk about the altitude, Utah is always been higher. Like mountain, that's what they talk about in the mountain states. It's elevated. You can see the 10. It hovers around 10. The nationals between around 7. But it's always higher. But what we're talking about is this spike.
Right.
It's just gone through the roof.
And there are listeners who won't know that what we're referring to with altitude is basically a few years ago, I think a well-intended Mormon apologist, wrote a blog post that actually got picked up that basically said maybe there was some data, some correlational data that suggested that the altitude was the cause or was correlated with the suicidality. And
well, altitude is correlated with suicidality. That's proven, right? That's not the problem. The problem is, the suicide experts at the University of Utah who were, publicizing that information didn't have bad intentions in publicizing it. That's one of the things we got to look at. We got to look at everything, but it just doesn't explain. Altitude just does nothing to explain a change in suicide rate. And since we noticed this 1 year ago, that's how long we've realized there was an escalating rate. And then the discussion of altitude becomes meaningless for that.
Got it.
But people keep pointing to that, and people keep bringing it up every single time we put out an article about the suicide rate. They say, well, it's because of the altitude. And if you stop and think for just a second, you will have to realize the altitude didn't triple. We aren't as high as Everest. We are still as just, at our 5,000 feet. So.
Yep. Okay. And just to kind of extend, it's not just youth, just youth. So let's talk about that second graph on the blog post too.
Yeah, as you can see, the adults, we don't have this the same alarming spike. You can see that the adults, which is 22 to 49, so we're still talking, it's still pretty tragic, these suicides. They're and we're seeing the same phenomena. The national rate, instead of being closer to 10 for the teens, is 15, so it's higher. And our baseline was around 20, which was higher, but now we've managed to nearly double the national rate with our adults. And so we can't, it's not just the youth. The youth, as you saw, the spike in the youth is much more dramatic and much more horrifying. But really, all the groups are nearly doubling. Well, the youth are more than doubling the national rate, but the adults are also nearly doubling the national rate, and that's concerning, right? And it's concerning because it's new. When you say, oh, it's the Western U.S., we're not seeing this kind of change anywhere else, except for, to some extent, Colorado and Idaho.
And Colorado and Idaho have a lot of Mormons. Colorado and Idaho have quite a bit of Mormons. Is that true?
Yeah, and I don't want to say that theirs is going up for the same reason or different reason. I don't think we know that. I think, I'm sure if you have opponents to marijuana, they're going to say, well, it's because of marijuana in Colorado. I mean, we don't know what is it exactly that would make Utah and Colorado have an escalating rate that we're not seeing in Arizona,
right.
And then the small states like Montana and Wyoming, you don't have enough data to really make sense of what's going on there. Idaho, the numbers are terrible in Idaho. I mean, really, really amazingly terrible there too. So, I mean, those states should also be really, really horrified at what's going on. But it's certainly not a nationwide phenomena. It's certainly not even a Western phenomena. There might be some slow growth in suicide, and there certainly is in older groups like the above 50. Yeah, it's pretty clear that there's a increased suicide throughout our country, especially on the West Coast, of people over 50, and that's not really noticeable in Utah. But the young people, we're seeing the growth, and it's you can just look and say, oh, it started right there in 2008 with the adults, and in the youth, you can see it also kind of jumping up there, but you're really seeing it going up in 2011 with the youth. And I guess I should mention that recently Desert News published a different set of numbers. I just don't know about those numbers, but they showed somewhat of an improvement in the youth rate in 2016, which we don't have numbers for. So I don't know about that because I really can't say how Utah gets its numbers compared to the CDC, but we do know that they ignore important groups when they're grouping them as suicides, because they don't necessarily group it as a suicide unless it can be kind of proven it's a suicide, which doesn't really grab a vast majority of the types of suicides that are actually taking the lives of so many. So I can't speak to that, and I kind of wish there was someone on the panel who could tell us about.
I can speak a little bit to like where the numbers are coming from, what the Utah Department of Health and CDC consider suicide and what they don't. I've talked to some people over there, and because of their criteria, we will never have accurate numbers ever, because they only consider currently 3 methods of death suicide unless there's a note, and there's rarely suicide notes. And those methods are self-inflicted gunshot wound, asphyxiation by hanging, and poison. And poison does not include ODing. That would be like drinking bleach or something. So the most common types of suicide are some type of a drug or pill overdose. You can do things like, jumping off a bridge or driving your car into a tree. All of those things they consider accidental death. So we're never going to have accurate numbers. I've talked with
and might I add that for example, the overdoses is a huge number, right?
Huge.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's
right. And I've talked with a few policemen, one in Ogden in particular, that were first on scene at an obvious suicide. And the parents there begged the police officers to write accidental death on the police report rather than suicide, because they didn't want that stigma for their child. But these policemen, I've asked them to talk about it or go on record, and they won't, because they'll lose their job for falsifying police records. And the numbers that people have reached out to me and I've collected, or Daniel or other people, I know Deborah Coe works a lot on this as well. A lot of those people consider anecdotal evidence, a story from parents or a school teacher that had a student, and I realize that those are anecdotal. But talking with Phil Rogers about a year and a half ago, he works for the AFSP, which is the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. He said he worked, yeah, he's since passed away. But he told me, he says, keep collecting all of that anecdotal, those stories, because at some point anecdotal evidence becomes what he calls a preponderance of evidence and is statistically valid. So it may be a combination of CDC numbers and Department of Health numbers and those people down on the ground that are like talking with people. It may be a combination of all of them, but I don't know if we will ever have accurate numbers that match theirs.
Got it.
But the trends, whatever they're doing, the trend is very visible.
Right, and escalating.
Yeah.
So I think it's time to start talking about correlates to the suicide, but that's tricky because we just got through reading guidelines that basically say, be really careful about ascribing blame to people's suicide. And we started by saying any suicide is a multifaceted act that can have many factors contributing, including life circumstances, maybe genetics, maybe someone's personal mental health, family situations, who knows what the many factors are. So those of us who are, frustrated with the LDS Church's policies would want to just say, like many did at this past General Conference, that the church has blood on its hands. So how do we talk about possible causes without violating the rules we just got through reading? Who wants to dive in and answer that?
Would it be too far off topic if I just kind of reviewed the events that Wendy, Tom, and I kind of experienced last year when this kind of all came to light? Because it kind of tells a narrative that, in a way, points out the pathology around how the discussion goes. And Wendy should be ready to correct me, but last year after the policy, there was just a huge amount of despair, right? So we have always suspected the suicides were higher, but we didn't have really a good set of data on that. Last year after the policy, it was, as Wendy discussed, she started getting reports of suicides. So we started getting a lot of anecdotes. And I just wanted to, make this public what went down with that, because we're still getting pushback around that a year later. Wendy reported those numbers to an audience, that leadership of affirmation, right? She just said,
it was just a conversation.
Yeah.
It was just a conversation with John, Gustav Rathel, and I. And he wrote a paper about the Affirmation Conference of California and mentioned it. So that's because I wasn't sure what to do with those numbers. Do I go public? Like I didn't want to cause further suicides by talking about it. But so that's how that kind of went about.
So it kind of came out and people were alarmed, going, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And so there was this big, wave of internet frenzy. And unfortunately, anytime the discussion goes out, then a lot of people out there are not obeying the rules, right? They are talking about it in an unhealthy way. And so then that starts even some of our allies pushing back, or even some of our own team basically criticizing people like Wendy, who didn't really publicize the number. All she did was just, mention it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and it kind of became public knowledge. But then something kind of really bad went down, which was how the Tribune reported it. Because the Tribune, who, normally is helpful, I think, decided to publish a comment from Wendy and that number, but then they totally undermined it by saying, without any explanation, that the state of Utah says there's only been 10 suicides in that time, which already is wrong. But they just didn't give us any chance. They didn't ask Wendy. They didn't ask somebody like me to say, well, why is there a difference in these numbers? And there's obvious a series of reasons why there would be a disparity, but they didn't bother to talk about that. They just they just put it out there, and that was immediately used to just undermine every thing Wendy had talked about and was noticing, and what a lot of us who are working in the realm are noticing, is that there is a lot of despair and there is more suicides. And so this was kind of upsetting to me to see how that came down and see how that was reported in such a way that was so unhelpful. And then to see, then we have everyone jumping on the bandwagon again about the altitude, and it's not a problem. And we now have the mama dragons debunked. It wasn't even the mama dragons; it was just a number that Wendy gave. And they failed to mention that all these other people, even like Natasha, who works, who does another podcast affiliated with Mormon Stories, she noticed it in her practice. I mean, practitioners were noticing it, and people in emergency rooms were noticing it. It was just a lot of, we can say anecdotes, but these are well-founded anecdotes. And so at that point, I got with Michael Barker, who runs the Rational Face blog. And so I put out the arguments I had, the points I had as to why I see it as being a big problem affecting LGBT. And so that's kind of what got me investigating, putting a lot of research into why, between me and Michael. And then Benjamin Knoll kind of joined the team, and he gave a more statistical analysis of what was going on. And everything just says, yeah, there's a big problem. And we don't know the exactness of it. We don't know all the details, but we can sure as heck say, yes, there is a huge problem that we just need to put some attention on. And thankfully, the Deseret News, treated us nicely, and they've subsequently reported a few times about how it is a problem, and they've even, the most recent article not long ago pointed out that, they just presented it as the fact that it is, that suicide is a problem for our LGBT teens. So I'm grateful for that response, and I'm usually happy with the Tribune, but in this case wasn't.
Okay. That's great. That's great backstory. And it's so tricky. It's just so tricky when you're trying to be a part of the solution. You're trying to just educate, and then everybody comes down and assaults you. Wendy, do you want to talk a bit about what that's like and how you cope with that? And Thomas, you can respond after Wendy.
Sure. Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised that the Deseret News handled that as well as they did. It wasn't a perfect article, but it was really, for a church's newspaper, it was really pretty good. It was incredibly difficult. Because we've been as public, and I think maybe because of the film on our family, we get messages all the time, sometimes as many as 100 a week, from gay Mormons, their parents, family members, many of them just heartbreaking, talking about suicidal ideation and some attempts. But far and away the most gut-wrenching are the people that reached out to me about the people that they lost to suicide. And they just want somebody to hear them and to validate their pain and their grief. And I have to say that it's both a sacred honor for me that they trust me with that, that intimate part of their family, but also it was just devastating to be the witness of so many. I literally felt like I was in a war zone. I mean, dozens of people in just months. If this was happening in any other community, if there was a serial killer out there killing this many people, if there was some type of a disease, the communities it was happening in would be up in arms, and they would be doing everything they could to fix it. But in the case of it being a gay or a trans person, oh well, it's just sad. Sorry, there's not much we're going to do about it. We're not going to talk about it. And when people do talk about it, we're going to engage in character assassination. We're going to make it every other possible reason than some of the reasons that it could be happening. And I think, I hope somebody at some point can do some type of like a correlation between the escalation in church rhetoric around traditional family, proclamation on the family against gay people, and track the numbers. That would be a very interesting thing to see, because we watched those numbers jump in 2008 around Proposition 8. And we see spikes every time something really awful happens. The policy, I think, was maybe one of the biggest spikes yet. So I'm not laying all of this at the feet of the church for responsibility, but there definitely is culpability there. You know, and I'm just watching this complete and utter devastation of a community that I love with my whole heart. And it's deeply personal for us because our own son spent about a year being very suicidal, to the point where I slept on the floor in his room some nights, and I hid pills and I hid knives, and I was worried every day to even leave him alone. And then I hear so many stories of people going through similar things, and every one of them feels like my son. We've lost people that are close to us, people that feel like family, and there's no recovering from it. It's just painful all the time. You know, and I also just want to throw out that everything I'm saying is, I am not representing affirmation. I'm not representing Mama Dragons. This is just my own personal knowledge and experience with this. But when all that went down, the articles started coming out at the end of January 2016, so a few months after the policy. And we literally were getting just crucified. I received some death threats for what we were doing, to the point where I really just backed off of all of it. It was just too difficult to keep doing that because, you know, we're trying to keep kids alive and people are, you know, really hostile and harsh about it.
I'm so sorry, Wendy. Thomas, do you want to add anything to what Wendy's been saying about the complexities of trying to talk about causes of this issue? And I'll unmute you really quick, Thomas. Okay, go ahead.
It is complex, but it's not just anecdotal. The one wonderful thing about the article that Daniel did with Michael Barker is they consolidated a lot of information that's in a lot of different places. They have the anecdotal, but they also include what is in there as direct evidence and indirect evidence. The direct evidence we have is that LGBT kids are directly impacted by rejection and rejecting families. That's the work that comes out of the Family Acceptance Project. It's pretty clear that rejecting families on an exponential scale increase all the risk factors for kids, including suicide, homelessness,
risky sexual behavior, drug use.
Yeah, all of the negative things you don't want your kid going into can be caused directly by rejecting behaviors of the parents.
And Thomas, tell us, and Daniel, Wendy, you can jump in. Tell us, Thomas, what are some of the classic rejecting behaviors so that people know what that means to reject your kid?
Denying that your kid's gay, saying that they're, you know, it's SSA, it's something that can be overcome if you just work and pray hard enough. Not letting them associate with anyone else that's gay, putting them into therapy to fix them from being gay. And quite honestly, just a lot of basic homophobia, you know, gay jokes, things that are a kid internalizes as, I've heard my dad say gay jokes, or ranting about Prop 8, or ranting about gay people and same-sex marriage. They're the enemy. You've got an April Ensign 2017 article talking about the war against Satan, including against same-sex marriage, counterfeit, worthless marriages. A kid hearing those things internalizes that as they're just coming to grips with, you know, puberty and finding that they're attracted to the wrong people. And they're internalizing already that their parents are going to reject them, their religion's going to reject them, and they're on the outside. And they either bury that, or if they come out, they could face consequences. I think one of the strongest indirect evidences is the homelessness in Utah. I think Ogden Outreach Center has statistics that the kids that come through their center, upwards of half of them are LGBT. And yet, in the population, we're talking about the incidence of LGBT being like around 5 to 10% at the most. And yet, half of the kids through the homeless shelter are LGBT. it's a massive sign that there is a huge level of rejection in Utah that LGBT kids face. That's not anecdotal anymore.
So Daniel, would you add anything to Thomas's list of rejecting behaviors that families and church and friends can contribute to?
I think that's pretty good. I think that you know, the negative comments, that we have to realize that people don't realize they're doing these rejecting behaviors. The list of rejecting behaviors are things that people just routinely do and don't consider them rejecting. Mormons sometimes aren't always so good at knowing, you know, what their rejecting behaviors are when it comes to someone they don't see as living their every, you know, commandment the way they think they should. And so, yes, by criticizing gays in general, you're rejecting your child that you don't know is gay by by having a big stink about that there's a gay character in Beauty and the Beast and posting on your Facebook that this is horrible. That's rejecting your gay child without realizing it. When you say that, you know, gays are horrible because they want gay marriage, then you're rejecting your gay child. It becomes more direct once you realize your child is gay, and then you do the things that they said, like not letting them identify themselves as they wish or as they see themselves, or not letting them associate with gay people, or not letting them have any positive role models, or punishing them, pathologizing it. And so, those are all on the list of rejecting behaviors. I think it's really helpful to go over the list of the Family Acceptance Project because they put a really nice summary there. And going to the
to our listeners, I just posted the link to the Family Acceptance Project in the feed. It's familyproject.sfsu.edu. Dr. Caitlin Ryan is the head of the Family Acceptance Project. And again, highly rejected LGBT youth will be 3 times more likely to engage in risky drug use, risky sexual behavior, and 8 times more likely to attempt suicide if they're highly rejected by their family. Is that the statistic, Daniel? Did I get that right?
Can I just...
go ahead, Daniel. Daniel, then Wendy.
Okay.
Well, Wendy, go first.
Okay, Wendy.
Okay, I just wanted to add, as far as we're talking about the Family Acceptance Project, her work has the gold seal from the AFSP, which is the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, as one of the best tools out there for suicide prevention. And it is the only tool out there for faith-based suicide prevention. And we LDS people, we're fortunate enough that it's for our faith, that she started with our faith. And it's also a little bit of a condemnation of our faith because we needed it the most, which is why she started with the Mormons rather than any other religion. But it's the best work we have in keeping our kids alive. And another thing that's excellent, especially for very conservative, traditional Mormon families of who I was before our son came out, is it shows you how to love and support your LGBT child and still hold on to your faith. Because for so many of us parents, it feels like either or. You choose your child or your church. You can't have both. And Caitlin's work, the brilliance of it is it shows you how to have both, if that's the path you want to take.
So to accept your LGBT Mormon youth, it doesn't mean you have to just let all sorts of unhealthy things happen all the time, all around, right? You can.
Right,
Caitlin talks about there's a range. You can go from highly rejecting to medium rejecting, and you're already going to improve their risk. So any Mormon, even if they don't buy into everything she's saying, can benefit by adopting at least some of them. And I do want to point out that that if you go to the website, they have a pamphlet that's specifically written by LDS people. It was written with the help of Dr. Robert Reese, who had served as a Mormon bishop. And it's really for a Mormon audience. I do want to point out that when they're asked to download it, they're asked to give an email. And this is just so they will send them one and one only survey that's totally optional. And so I'm just encouraging people to not be scared to give their email to get the copy of that brochure, because it's really worth it. And they'll see that in the publications section. But what I wanted to also talk about, when you mentioned the 3 times risk of HIV infection, the 3 times risk of drug abuse that accompanies the rejecting families. I just want to point out that, one, these ideas around rejection also apply to non-gay people, right? They're good ideas for any of your children. And a lot of Mormons have children who might, for other reasons, appear to be straying from the path. And they might also be at higher risk of suicide. And if you just sort of take these same ideas and work with your children in a way to, encourage them to do what you think is best, but at the same time, avoid rejection, you're going to help save their lives. But the main thing I wanted to say about all this is that going back to what we talked about in the guidelines for discussing suicide, there is not just one thing that leads to suicide. It's kind of like the Titanic. A lot of bad things come together at the wrong time in the wrong place. And what those are the risk factors. And the different risk factors, they add up in any one individual. So if you have the risk factor of having a family history of major depression, obviously there's going to be a higher risk of depression, and therefore depression is clearly a risk factor for suicide. If you use drugs or alcohol, there's another risk factor. If you had a family commit suicide within the past year, then you're a higher risk. So anyone who has these risk factors, they're going to add up, and you're going to, when you want to prevent suicides, you want to try to modulate the risks as best you can. So yeah, let's not blame it on any one issue, but let's take this one issue about rejection and realize that it impacts several of the risk factors, because we know that drug and alcohol use is a risk factor for suicide, but family rejection becomes a risk factor for using the drugs and alcohol in the first place. And the risk for suicide is augmented with depression, but we know that having lack of family and community supports is a big risk factor for depression. So these things all kind of do a dance together: the drug use, the HIV infection, the depression, the suicide. They are doing a dance with the risk factors that the biggest one we can help with is the rejection that they receive from the people around them, from their communities. And I would say the family is the most important, the community and the church are shortly after that. But then once again, there's a dance, because the community impacts how the family behaves. The church impacts how each family behaves. So the fact that, yeah, the LGBT person might be rejected at church by the things they're hearing from church leaders, but also when the church leader says something rejecting, the families might be parroting that, or that might give them license to say negative things about LGBT people, which will then go on and be, make the child feel more rejected by their family.
Hey,
so
Daniel,
all these things, it's an interaction, it's a web. And so no, there's not just one thing that makes someone suicidal, but there is certainly one thing that makes a lot of their risk factors go up. And then if you add into the fact that just the community baseline, the altitude, yeah, we've all got the altitude, so we all have that risk factor. So let's not give us more. A certain set of people are going to be using drugs or experiencing depression unrelated to any of this, but let's not give them another risk factor that's totally preventable, right? And so, yeah, we don't want to simplify it. And in any one case, it's never just one thing, but let's lower the risk factors that we can impact, right?